Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share some watercolor house mouse cards using the House Mouse Designs Tree-mendous Christmas collection from Spellbinders. So we have 3 different stamp sets here. I always love the images from House Mouse. They do a fantastic job. And I also love that they always come with a couple sentiments that are appropriate for that image. And these are no exception. There's several different sentiments in each set that you can choose to go with whatever you're creating. Because I'm doing watercolor cards, I'm using some watercolor cardstock. This is distress watercolor cardstock. I love using it because it's a nice bright white, but you can use whatever watercolor cardstock works best for you. I'm also going to stamp and emboss my images. When I'm doing watercoloring, I like to emboss the images. Not only does it give it an extra texture by having that glossy embossing for the lines, but it also means you don't have to be quite as careful when you're doing your embossing. When you're doing your watercoloring. By embossing the images, it adds a raised edge or raised line around all of the details. And because of that, you can watercolor completely different colors right beside each other, and that raised line keeps those colors separate unless you happen to go over the line, and then they would start to run together. If you didn't want to stamp and emboss your images, you could just stamp them with a permanent ink, and that would work perfectly as well. However, then you do need to be a little bit more careful when you're doing your watercoloring. You don't want to watercolor next to a color if it's still wet. You need to wait for each area to dry. So I do find that by stamping and embossing my images, the watercolor process goes a whole lot quicker because I can work right next to another color that is still wet. So I'm stamping and embossing my images with some walnut stained distress glaze. It's a nice brown, and it's just a little bit nicer than having a really dark black around my images. For the details on the mice, there is so much detail in that fur that not all of it can be watercolored because that embossing powder is going to resist the watercolor. So by using some walnut brown distress glaze, I have almost kind of colored part of it anyways with that embossing. So I'm stamping my images with VersaMark ink using my Misti stamping tool. I'm also using some embossing powder tool when I remember which is the first card and I forgot for the other 2 before embossing them. I'm using my heat tool to melt that embossing powder. Now, my heat tool is like 35 years old. It is very, very well loved, very well used, and every once in a while it likes to overheat. And that must have happened for this second image because it didn't want to work. So I grabbed my Ranger Heat It tool. I regularly use this tool for drying different mediums or sprays because it's a lot gentler than using my embossing tool. It can be used to emboss, but it takes significantly longer. And I'm saying like 3, 4, 5 times longer than using my embossing tool. The area that the heat comes out of is a lot bigger than my embossing tool, so it's a lot broader. The heat is a lot more gentle, so it doesn't melt that powder quite as nicely. And I have not used this tool for embossing in such a long time that I was worried that I was melting the powder right into the paper because it just wasn't embossing to the speed that I was used to, or even close to the speed that I was used to. Fortunately, this is the only one that tool, my regular heat tool, didn't work for. It worked for the 3rd card, and off screen I actually ended up using it for a few spots on this particular card that just wouldn't melt no matter how long I put my heat tool over it. So anytime someone asks me if the heat tool will emboss, technically it will, but it's well worth it to have both tools if you like to emboss as well as like to dry different mediums, because they're each meant for different purposes. And I definitely do not like using this tool for embossing. It'll work in a pinch when you can't use your regular one, but it's not my preferred method at all. So you can see that even as I'm talking, I have still been doing this, and this is at double speed of what it actually took. It took a really long time. So now that this one is kind of embossed, and like I said, I go off screen and touch up a few spots that just weren't melting no matter how hard I tried. I am ready to stamp and emboss the 3rd one here. These stamps, there's one that is fall themed and then 2 that are Christmas themed. So they're perfect for different seasonal cards that you want to make. I absolutely love the little fall one. I think it's so cute. just the mouse with the autumn leaves I think are adorable. And then again, their Christmas images are fantastic. For my third image here, I wanted my sentiment to be a different color embossing than my image. So I stamped both of them at the same time, but when I was putting my embossing powder down, I made sure that it was only on the image, and I made sure when I tilted my cardstock that it wasn't going to go over my VersaMark stamped sentiment, so that I could add some gold embossing powder to that sentiment. I knew for the star at minimum for this image, I was going to use some gold for it. So I wanted that sentiment to tie in with those metallic accents. So once again, my regular tool is now working again, and it melts this so much quicker. And I can actually visibly see the difference a lot easier with this tool than with my heated tool. So with all of the images stamped and embossed, I'm ready to do my watercoloring. Now I watercolor regularly with distress reinkers. These are intended for reinking distress pads, but I always love when my supplies do more than one job. So I like to use them for watercoloring as well. They're a dye-based ink. They're liquid ink. I have them in an alcohol ink palette here, and I have a little label that says the color to the bottom right of each color, plus I've watercolored that label with the color. These colors are so concentrated that, especially the darker ones, it's really hard to see exactly what color it is, so those labels are very, very helpful. The one thing to note though is these colors will not dry in that palette, so the palette has to be stored horizontally. You cannot tip it vertically, otherwise they'd all run. So I'm starting off with the background of this card, and I'm coloring it with some Stormy Sky. I like to make sure that I have a darker color around my image, and then I kind of fade it out to nothing. It's just a look that I like. You could easily, if you wanted, color that entire background and have that entire sky colored. I just think this looks a little bit interesting, but it might not be for everyone, and that's totally fine. So as I'm working, I will keep on touching up my color until I'm happy with the final result. For the floor or the ground part here, I'm using some frayed burlap, and same as my sky, I make my the color darkest where my image is and then work my way out to nothing. So I always start where I want my color to be darkest, and then as I work my way out to nothing, the water from my brush is just going to water down that paint easily and get a natural highlight or natural shade, or just naturally change the color. I'm using a water brush that has water in the handle, so when I want to clean my brush, or if I want to add more water to a color, I just squeeze that handle gently. I have a paper towel to my bottom right to make it easy to clean my brush off. I love this water brush. I use it so often, and I tend to be a little bit of a klutz. So if I had a regular paintbrush with a jar of water on my desk, there's a very good chance that I will tip it over. And by doing this, I don't have to worry about that. So my mouse here is watercolored with some gathered twigs distressed ink. I start with the darkest color around the edges of the mouse and then work my way in. If by chance I get a little bit too much color, it's really, really easy to just lift it up with the brush, wipe my brush off on the paper towel, and I can do that as many or as few times as I want. Obviously, once the paint has dried, it's a little bit harder to do that, but while it's still wet, it's really, really easy to do. And as I said before, that embossing is going to resist the watercolor. So sometimes I'll get a little bit of a pool of a certain color in a certain area if by chance there's a lot of embossing in that area. I do make sure to take my brush and clean those areas up. I've used a little bit of Tattered Rose for the mouse nose, in the ears, the feet, hands, and the tail. And then for my acorns, I use some Vintage Photo. Now to add a little bit of extra visual texture to this card, I'm using some Autumn Leaves Magicals. These are pigment powders that are dissolvable by water, but they have some shimmer to them. So the Autumn Leaves one has autumn colors, so I'm using the orange color, the brown color, there's a little bit of green that I use, and then there's a red that I use. I don't remember the exact names of them, but they're all from that same set. So because they're powder, I can tip my brush into there, lift up that powder, and I can either color directly with it and kind of mix it with the water on my brush on the piece that I'm painting, or I can do it on my glass work surface. Either one works totally fine. If by chance you get a little bit too much powder on your brush, probably easier to do it on the glass surface. And if you don't have a glass surface to work on, like a piece of plastic will work, a acrylic block will work, an old sour cream container lid that's cleaned up can work. Really anything will work as a palette. So with that first one done, I'm ready to watercolor my second image. And I'm going to watercolor all of my images, let them completely dry before I assemble my cards. So for this one here, I'm using some Evergreen Bough for the tree greenery. I thought the name was suitable. I will often pick the colors that I'm using based on some of the names, depending on if it goes with the theme of what I'm doing. I don't know. It just seems appropriate. So after doing the greenery for the tree, I'm using that same color for the area that they're sitting on. That way it coordinates together beautifully. Just like the last card, I start with where I want my color to be darkest and then work my way out till it kind of fades to nothing. I also want a little bit of that color in one of my little paint jars here, again, to coordinate with that. And any of these colors can easily be changed, and you could also easily use other things for watercoloring. I will regularly use my Distress watercolor crayons as well. They have the same colors as the Distress refills. I just love the refills, mostly simply because they are already wet. They are super, super easy to use. And with this brush, there's very little mess. I mean, there's not a lot of mess with the watercolor crayons either, but I do find having an open palette with a lot of different colors on there quite convenient. So for the reds here, I'm using some Barn Door. It's a nice bright red. And then I'm going to go in and start coloring my mice. So I have one mouse colored with Hickory Smoke Distress refill and one done with ground espresso. Really any color of browns and grays I think will work well with this. And if you've used Distress before, you know that there's a whole lot of different brown shades that you can pick and choose from. So just like my last card, I start with where I want the color on the mice to be the darkest, and then I work my way in so we have some natural shading and highlighting. If there's any area that's a little bit too dark, I can easily just use my clean brush to pull that color off, wipe it off on my paper towel, and then I have a clean brush again. And then between colors, if I still have some color on my brush, I can just squeeze the handle of the brush to flush water through that brush, and then again I have a nice clean brush. For the noses, the tails, the hands, for this one as well, I'm using that Tattered Rose, and then I'm pulling in that ground espresso to do the brush of the water brush that they're painting the ornament with. It's the same one that I used for one of the mice, but it's going to work just fine for the brush as well. For the tops of my jars, I'm using a little bit of weathered wood. It's a blue that has a bit of a gray to it, so I thought it kind of worked well for the tops of the jars. Another one that I think would work well is Lost Shadow. That's just a really, really light gray color. Now to add some metallic accents to my ornaments, I'm using some Perfect Pearls. These are pigment powders that have a binding agent in them that's activated with water. I'm using Pewter, which is the silver color, and then Sunflower Sparkle, which is the gold color. It's nice bright gold. I like to mix it in the lid and then let it completely dry before putting the lid back on my Perfect Pearls. You could also, if you have a glass surface or any other palette that you like to mix paint on, acrylic block, whatever, it would work on there, and it just cleans up with water. So you don't need anything special to clean it up. I wanted this ornament to have kind of gold and silver sparkle or stripes to it. So I paint it silver first, and then I use that brush to pull some of the excess away just to give it a little bit more of a highlight on the top of the ornament, and then a little bit more shading at the bottom. And obviously do that as much or as little as you want. And if you don't necessarily want to have a highlight on there, you could easily just do solid colors. Then I go in with the Sunflower Sparkle, just adding a tiny little bit of water. Depending on how much paint you need, is how much you could make. You can really customize it and control it. And these little pots, even though they look tiny, they last such a long time. They last, well, they're almost a lifetime supply, really. So with Perfect Pearls, if you add a lot of water to it, it's going to water it down a lot, and you're going to get more of a transparent paint. If you have a lot of the powder and less water, you're going to have more of a thick, opaque paint. So you can really control the look of it depending on how much or how little water you add to the powder. Once I'm done the stripes on the one ornament, I can use that same paint to add gold to the stars and the ornament that is in the branches, and then I can set that aside to completely dry. For my third image, I'm doing weathered wood for the background. Like I said before, it's a blue that has a bit of a gray to it. I will often use either weathered wood or Stormy Sky for like wintry skies because they're not quite as bright. They're a little bit more gray to them. They're very similar in color, and I'll often use weathered wood and Stormy Sky together for different black backgrounds if I want to blend them into each other. I didn't want the first and the third background to be exactly the same color, but they absolutely could. If you only had one, you could easily just use one. Just like before, I'm starting where I want the color to be darkest, which is typically behind or on the horizon and behind my little images, and then work my way out to nothing. And just like I said before, if you want the entire sky to be colored, you absolutely could. Another option would be to watercolor like this, trim your piece down, and then do a little bit of ink blending around the edge. If you didn't necessarily want it to be completely solid, but you wanted a little bit more color to go around the edge, that's also an option. Once I have my sky done, I'm working on the snow part, and I chose to do some lost shadow. Even though snow is white, there's still some shadow to it. So you still need to do a little bit of coloring to it to make it look a little bit more realistic. So I'm doing the lost shadow. It's a really, really light gray, just doing most of it right around the feet and the bodies of the mice, and then blending my way out to nothing. So there is some color there, but it's not a lot of color. And even though the lost shadow is quite light, I'm adding some water to it just so that it's just like kind of a kiss of color. And then I'm coloring in my mice, and for this one I'm using some ground espresso for some of them, as well as hickory smoke for others. If there's ever multiple mice in a picture, I often like to do them a little bit different colors just to make sure that they're not exactly the same. You can easily do them all the same color if you want, but I think it looks a little bit more interesting if they're just different shades. So just like the other mice in the other images, I'm using the color. I start with the color on the outside of the image and then work my way in. And if there's ever any area that's a little bit too heavy, I just lighten it up by pulling the color up with just some water on my brush. Now there's 4 different mice on this image, and they could easily be 4 different shades of brown or gray. I just use those 2 colors and kind of alternate between the mice, making sure that some of them are a little bit lighter, some of them are a little bit darker, just to give them just unique differences between each other. Once the browns are done, then I can use that Tattered Rose to add the kind of pinky peachy color to the noses, the tails, the feet, and the hands. And then I'm ready to start coloring in my ornaments. So for a nice pop of color, I'm going to do 2 of those ornaments in that barn door. It's a nice bright red. And then I'm going to do one of the ornaments with that pewter perfect pearls so that we also have some metallic to this image as well. I think adding metallics or shimmery finishes just adds a little bit more interest. We still have the difference between the watercolor and the gloss from the embossing powder, but I think adding just some metallics or something that has a little bit of a different visual texture makes it a lot more interesting. So I'm using the perfect pearls. Another option would be to use, say, interference inks to watercolor. You could use the reinkers, or if you have just the pads, you could smush it onto your work surface or a piece of plastic and pick that up with your water brush to color with. Or if you don't have either of those, metallic gel pens would work to just color those in. For my little tree here, I'm using some Evergreen Bough. This is the same color that I used for the greenery for the last card. So I'm doing a coat over the whole thing, and then I'm going back in and making it darker in some areas. What I will typically do is wait for that to dry just a little bit, and then I will use my brush to create some brush strokes just to get a little bit more texture. We're already having that texture on there with the embossing, so we already have that there, but I also think it's nice to add that with your brush as well. So with the distress reinkers done, I can go in with that pewter to color that one ornament there, and I'm also going to use that pewter for the ornament tops as well. Now, when I did my ornaments with the barn door, I also made sure that there's some areas of those that are lighter than the others. So again, there's a natural highlight to them. With the pewter done, I can do the Sunflower Sparkle Perfect Pearls on the star. And then I let everything dry completely. Before assembling my cards, I'm using some different dies to create shapes out of those images. It's just going to add a little bit more interest as well. So this first one here, I'm cutting with the Essential Arches die, and I have another die cut set aside for a mat for that. The second one here, I'm using the Mirrored Arch label die set, and all of these die sets have a bunch of different sizes to them. So you can pick and choose which size works best with your image and for your card. I also like to tape my dies down if I think they might shift on me. My cardstock there was a little bit warped from the watercoloring. So I used some Best Ever Craft tape to tape that down just to make sure that it wasn't going to shift on me while I was doing my die cutting. For this last one here, I'm using the Fresh Picked label die set. Now I chose 3 different shapes here for a little bit of variety, but if you wanted, you could choose one shape and do all 3 of them as long as it worked for the image. This first one here is going to be a vertical card, so depending on the shape that you choose, it might not work for horizontal cards. Like for instance, this particular Essential Arches shape would look odd in a horizontal card. Not saying you couldn't do it, but it would be a little bit different than using it for a vertical card, whereas the other 2 could either be horizontal or vertical. So off screen, I die cut my mats for each one of the cards, and I'm just gluing them onto plain white A2 card bases. I'm keeping it very, very simple, but you could also, if you had some printed paper that coordinated with the colors that you painted in your image, you could also add some of that printed paper to the background of the card to tie all of that in if you wanted. I'm using Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle for gluing all of my layers together. I use this for pretty much everything. Liquid glue goes a really, really long way, and having it in a fine line bottle means that I can use it for teeny tiny die cuts, or I can use it for gluing larger areas like this. Once all of those are dry, I'm going to take that one image that I didn't add a sentiment to the front of the card. I'm going to stamp it in the inside of the card using some Barn Door Distress ink. I have it in my Misti stamping tool so I can stamp it multiple times just to make sure that I have a nice, crisp, clean stamped image on the inside. I'll let that dry for a few moments. And then one of the other things that I really like to do when I'm doing house mouse cards is add just a little bit of extra texture to it. And I do that with either stickles or glossy accents. And in this case, I'm going to do both. I'm not going to do that on the first card with the mouse with the leaf because there's not really an area that either one of them works well on. Sometimes if the eyes on the mice are open, I'll do it for the eye with glossy accents just to give it a nice beady eye. But that particular image, the eye is closed. And for these other images here, the eyes are really, really tiny, and they're also already glossed and beady with the embossing on them. So I use some stickles for the snow on the first card, and then I use some glossy accents for on some of the ornaments. I will use my die pick to help direct that glossy accents for the star. I want to make sure that we have some pointed tips to them, and my die pick is definitely going to help with that. If by chance you get any bubbles when you're using glossy accents, you want to use a pin or a thumbtack or something to pop those bubbles while it's still liquid. If you let it dry like that, there's no way to get it out. There's no way to correct that. So while everything is really liquid, you'll want to use something to pop those up. Unless it's in an area where it works with the design or whatnot, then you can just leave it. But I definitely try to pop them ahead of time. For my second card here, I'm using some glossy accents on the ornament that's hanging. And then I'm going to use some stickles over top of the gold perfect pearls for the stars, just to add that glitter sparkle. I'm using some Starburst stickles. Here it's just an opalescent. It's got no color to it, so you're going to see the color from underneath. It's just going to add that glitter to it. Another option here, if you say didn't use the perfect pearls, the gold perfect pearls on those stars, would be to use some gold stickles on them. It's going to have a completely different look. By using the Stardust stickles over the gold perfect pearls, it kind of has a bit more of a subtle look to it, but you still get that metallic. It just really depends on what you have and the look that you're going for. So once they are completely dry, these are the finished result. And I would definitely do the glossy accents after die cutting all your pieces. I've made that mistake before doing glossy accents ahead of time. First of all, you need to make sure that it's completely dry before you do any die cutting. And then because of the pressure from the die cutting machine, it often changes the finish on the glossy accent. So I definitely recommend, when you remember, to do the die cutting ahead of time and do the stickles and the glossy accents last. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.